Hi everyone. This is the last lecture for English 102 online, and this will show you a little bit more about Kairos, that new rhetorical appeal that we've been talking about, and it will also talk about how you can use the new tool of Kairos in helping you to develop your final presentation for major assignment for English 102. Of course, I'll also be talking about, of course, you'll also be using other rhetorical strategies that we've talked about this semester, like ethos, pathos, and logos when you're developing your presentation. But I do want to focus a little bit on Kairos a little bit more, and towards the end of the lecture, I'll also offer some tips for some commonly asked questions about the assignment and how you can troubleshoot and develop a great project, because I'm really looking forward to seeing what all you guys come up with. So let's get started. So just to refresh your brain, we talked a little bit about Kairos last time, but Kairos is basically the rhetorical appeal of understanding the when in a piece of writing. So what the ancient Greeks taught was that it was important to know when to say something in the right way in order to convince an audience of it, and also to consider how authors or speakers use that place and time, that when, in what particular moments to persuade their audiences of particular purposes. And that can be kind of easy to see in nonfiction, especially think about social media. You know, if you're going to try to raise money for a trip that you're going on a social media funding site like GoFundMe or something like that, it's going to be, you aren't going to post, that you need to raise money an hour before you need to have like your first check due for this trip that you're going on. You're going to need to consider the right moment in time to ask your audience, to give them time, to have their next paycheck, to give you that money. When we talk about Kairos in fiction, though, it's a little bit different. The things that we need to examine are when things are written, who they're written for, and how those things affect the writing. And that's going to help us understand the text even more. Now, we've already talked about authority, who the writer is, emotion, how they appeal to the audience's sense of emotion, and logos, the logical argument that they use in their writing to convince their audience of that purpose. But I thought that we would talk a little bit more about Kairos so that you could understand how it might help you, especially in your development of your presentation. And I'm going to talk at first about how Barry uses Kairos in his piece, and then and those might be some observations you can use in your presentation. But you might also consider this as a model of how you might use Kairos by looking at how authors like Barry use Kairos. If this is feeling a little fuzzy, don't worry. Hopefully by the end of this lecture it won't be so fuzzy. So let's get started. So think about Peter Pan and Wendy. What types of things do we need to know about the piece to understand the Kairos? And those questions that we just saw, wrong way, sorry, not trying to make you dizzy. My mouse is going nutty. What did I do? Okay, hold on, guys. Technical difficulties. I gotta zoom back out. There we go. So to understand what we need to know about the piece, we need to know when is it written, who's it written for, and how these things affect the writing. And that information that I had you find in your annotated bibliography was to kind of help you answer those questions of Kairos, which you should have done in your rhetorical inquiry. My dog's now decided that no part on the couch is comfortable to her, so you're probably going to hear her jumping up and down off the couch, and groaning like she just did in the background because she's not getting attention because I'm giving you guys attention. So apologies for that. So back to what we were talking about. So in the rhetorical inquiry, I already asked you to start thinking about those Kairos items, but we need to think about how Kairos is working and what I think about it too. So this will kind of help you make sure that you're on the right track. So in major assignment 3 in the annotated bibliography, you found out some background information on Barry and his audience. And so knowing who he was and when he created this and who he created it for is essential in understanding what he was trying to accomplish. And that's the simplest way to explain the Kairos. That's when you're answering those questions, you're understanding the Kairos. Okay, it's nothing more complicated than that. And in your research, you should have found out more about Barry and who he was, his troubled childhood, the fact that he grew up in the late Victorian era, that he publishes, the play first in 1904, then he publishes the novel, which we're focused on, in 1910. So his intended audience comes from that time period. So to say Peter Pan is beloved by children today, okay, that could be, but he didn't think about us in 2016 and what we would have thought about the piece when he was writing it. He was thinking about the here and the now, okay? So one thing that Kairos can kind of get students in trouble with is that they feel that it's so important to give so much background information that in their presentation all they do is give background information and summarize his entire life, okay? Don't waste your time summarizing Barry's entire life. The class already knows this information. They should have learned this information. Instead, use background information to clarify a point in your thesis or argument about the text itself. So here's an example of that. For example, if you want to say that Wendy represents the typical middle-class young female, then you might use some information on Barry's experience with women in his life to clarify a point that he's trying to make about young women in that time period, okay? So that's how you could use Kairos in a good way to give background to clarify a point, okay? So another thing that Kairos helps us with is understanding the audience and purpose and context. Now remember, when we're talking about the intended audience for the piece, we're talking about people in the early 1900s. They're in Great Britain. Some of you noticed that the grammar or the language was different. That's because it's the British spelling and it's got a lot of British slang. He uses words that British children would have understood in the time. And so that's some of that context that you need to know to be able to explain who the intended audience is. Now, there are some times when you might want to talk about the modern audience, and you might want to say, Barry intended that the audience from 1910 would learn this about women in 1910. However, what audiences of Barry's work can see today is this about women from 1910, okay? So be specific. When you're switching between audiences in your presentation, let your audience, your colleagues know who it is you're speaking about. So if you're talking about the intended audience, be specific. Tell us. Now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how the intended audience would have viewed Wendy, okay? Or if you're switching to the modern audience, say, going to how the modern audience would have viewed this, now I'm going to explain to you how modern audiences might view Wendy. So be specific. And here's a little tip. Just be aware of the audience when you make claims in your presentation. And the one way to do so is to consider the context, okay? And so some of the context of that audience from the original intended audience They're going through some massive political changes, not only the suffragette movement for women. That's why I keep mentioning women, because that's a big, women's issues are a big thing that are happening this time. But there's also a lot of world conflict that's going on. Maybe you don't care about women's issues from 1910. That's not something that you're interested in. But maybe you're interested in World War One. That's a huge political change that's taking place, and there's definitely some allegory and symbolism about concerning socialism, fascism, communism, and World War One that can be read into the piece. So those are some political changes in the context that you probably kind of got a little experience with in your research. These are things that you might need to explain to your classmates, right? Because the idea that this is, building up to a world war, the First World War, if you were going to explore that and how that affects the piece, then your classmates, when they were researching it, might have read that that's something that happened in the time period, but they might not know enough background about that to be able to make the connection. That's where your research is key there. That's where you could insert that research to explain to them how you came to that connection in your research. And that's where you'd have to dig a little deeper, okay? So think about the context as the things you need to know and the things you might need to explain. So if you have an idea and you're like, it's kind of fuzzy, I need to know more about it to explain it, that's where you go research more and add a source, okay? And then remember, if you had to go research it and find a source in order to make sure that your colleagues understand it when they're listening to your presentation, that's where you might need to explain and give more details. So research is key here. This is a research project, okay? So how are some other ways, and we'll talk a little bit more about sources here in a second. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about sources, but I want to come back to Kairos again while it's still kind of fresh in our brain before we totally switch to discussing the project. So how does Kairos affect our understanding of Peter Pan and Wendy? So you might be thinking, okay, Professor Buzzard, like I've looked at all of these things, I've done this research, I'm just randomly searching for stuff, I'm writing down brainstorms, I'm answering the questions like you're asking, and I've got some ideas of things I'm interested in, but how in the world do I put this all together to a presentation, and what do I explore or examine in a thesis? Some things that you could do is use Kairos to guide you. Maybe look at the intended audience and the context to explore a particular theme in the piece. Or maybe you look at the plot of the piece and how the plot moves because of the place and time and affects our understanding of Peter Pan and Wendy. Maybe you look at the structure of the novel or the style, how it's written. I mean, many of you in your annotations noted about the language and how different the language was. Well, that style is a very specific style. Barry wrote it for young people to be able to read the novel, and he wrote in a very simplistic style. What we might find difficult for the intended audience is a simplistic style, but for the modern audience, what makes it difficult is it's not simplistic because the slang, the spelling, that's all the slang and spelling of children from that time period. And I mean, you can look online at social media and look at, someone in their like late teens, early 20s, the types of words and abbreviations that they use today aren't always readable by people from another group. So he's writing for a very specific group. And so maybe you want to examine style. So you can use those major literary terms as kind of umbrellas to exploring a particular topic. And you really can take it in any direction that you like. I don't care which way you go in it. Go with what you're interested in. If you're really interested in, how the Lost Boys function as kind of like this socialist group, explain that, or if you're really interested in, how women might have been treated in that time period historically, go from a historical perspective. Maybe you're interested in the psychology of the piece. It doesn't matter. The world is your oyster as long as you're understanding the rhetorical situation. Just remember, I haven't already said it enough, the rhetorical situation is that relationship between the author, audience, and the text, and that's all glued together by the context. In this case, we have our author of Barry, our intended audience of young people, 1910s Britain, and our purpose to explore, that fantasy world and bring out some different, morals and lessons about family relationships and growing up. I mean, and even coming to terms with death in some instances. So there's some really big themes that are kind of happening in this piece that you could explore. And whatever your research has led you to might be the direction that you go in. So visit the Bedford Lit Gloss online for more information on the terms that I had there if you still need a little refresher on some literary terms. This website is awesome. It's a literary glossary. It's free, and they have great explanations and even some tutorials on literary terms, and it is an academic source. So if you needed to provide a definition in your presentation, I would definitely recommend the Bedford Lit Gloss. I'll put a link to this inside the course shell for you. Okay, so we've talked about Kairos, and I've kind of weaved in a little bit about some ways that you might do your presentation surrounding Kairos. But let's talk a little bit about major assignment 4 and move a little bit away from Kairos specifically, but talk about what are some ways that you can create your major assignment 4, and also answer some kind of commonly asked questions or emails that I get pertaining to major assignment 4. So the first question I usually get is, what exactly do I need to discuss? What are you looking for? I'm wanting you to examine the rhetorical situation in any way that you want to. I want you to talk about the text. I want you to talk about the audience and the purpose. I don't care what, there are an infinite number of ways that you can talk about the text, the audience, and the purpose. I want you to trust yourself as a writer and a thinker and take this in any direction you want to explore, as long as you are doing an analysis and not a summary, okay? If you turn in a presentation that's just a biography of Barry's life, or if you turn in a presentation that's just a summary of the novel itself, then you're not really analyzing the rhetorical situation. You're just reporting on the topic, okay? I want you to explain to me some aspect that you find interesting and that you've researched about the text and how it influences the audience and the purpose. It's as simple as that. That's all I want you to do. Don't overthink it, okay? So the next question that I usually get is, okay, great, now I know what I'm going to write about. How the heck do I make this presentation? Okay, you need to use some sort of format, presentation format. Some of you will want to use PowerPoint. That's okay with me. Prezi is great. You can get an education account using your D2L email address or your Midlands Tech email address. It doesn't cost you anything. I think the slides look prettier. I think it's easier to use than PowerPoint. There's also a million other websites out there that'll let you develop presentations, some of which I have no idea about. You could do something on YouTube. Anything you want to do, it's up to you. You just need to be able to deliver the presentation with a voiceover so that we can post them to the discussion board and so that your classmates can click on a link. Click on a link and listen to you give your presentation. So I don't care what kind of format you use, as long as you can upload that presentation to the discussion board and your colleagues can click on a link or a file and immediately be able to open it and watch and listen to your presentation, okay? So it's up to you how you make it. If you want to use Prezi, I think it's really easy to use. I think it's way easier to use than PowerPoint. That's my personal opinion. They have a huge help resource that has little video tutorials on how to do everything from creating your first Prezi to adding voice, etc. Anything that you want to do is fine with me, as long as you have the ability to post it to the discussion board by the due date. Also, I'll add on to that, even though I moved away from the slide, that if you do not have a microphone on your laptop or tablet or cell phone, almost 98% of you do. That's okay. Don't feel bad about that. But email me like today and let me know. I have a couple of headsets that are my personal headsets that I'll let you borrow. That you can borrow, and you'll just have to, on the honor system, make sure you return it to me. And we can plan up a meetup time or day, and I can let you borrow one. So if you don't, I need to know now, though, so that we can arrange getting it to you in time. Okay? So another question I get is what types of sources? So you can have a variety of multimodal sources, and that's just a fancy way of saying a variety of different types of medium. If you want some images of Peter Pan and Wendy, great. If you want to show us a short video clip, awesome. If you want to have sources from the library and the databases that came from like your annotated bibliography or extra things you saw, wonderful. As long as they are academic sources. And the Little DK Handbook and the Bedford have some really good tips on making sure that you have good quality academic sources, okay? You should also have primary and secondary sources, and you should by now know the difference between those two things from your reading that you've been doing this semester. If you haven't figured that out, let me just refresh. A primary source is a source that comes from or is written during the time period. So that could be the novel itself. It could be a review of the play or the novel that someone wrote in 1905 or 1910. It could be some sort of historical document that comes from that time period. Okay, that's what a primary source is. You're going to have at least one primary source, and that's going to be the novel. You should quote the novel in your text. There might be other things that you find. There's so much stuff you can find. You should also have secondary sources. Secondary sources are written about a text or an item after it's happened. And those secondary sources are going to be like current articles on Peter Pan and Wendy. Maybe there's something from Psychology Today that was written, 10 years ago about Peter Pan and Wendy. That's considered a secondary source because it's after the time period in which the source occurred, okay? So you're going to need to have a variety of primary and secondary sources. And if you look at the major assignment 4 overview, there's some more details on the number of sources and what all you need. I'm just looking for a range of different sources. You can, again, use those sources from your annotated bibliography. You can add in extra sources. It's fine by me. Make sure that you do cite your sources in text if you directly quote them. If you look through the lectures that I've delivered, whenever I've had a direct quote, I always give an in-text citation. If you paraphrase, just put your citation at the end of the slide. Images can be a little tricky, and as a matter of fact, MLA's come up with an update and they're changing the way we cite images. Just if underneath the image, if in your presentation, you could just put a link to the image, that's fine with me. I don't want to discourage you from having images. It's fine with me for this presentation if you do that. You don't have to put them on the works cited page. Just copy and paste a link to the image, kind of make it smaller underneath the image itself so I can see where you got them from. That is fine with me, but do know that other instructors will ask that you cite those later. There's just some MLA update changes, and I don't know all the rules yet because they just came out like last month, and so I don't want to teach you something that is going to be outdated as soon as you learn it, because that seems kind of worthless to me. So I'm fine with images if you just want to put a little link under them. There is no official way to cite a YouTube video, but there is a model for a video on the web. So if you just want to make sure it, fake it till you make it look good, and I'll believe that that's the right way to do it if you have that information in there that you need. So again, types of sources, you're going to have articles, journals, journal articles. You might have, those literary stubs from the library. There's a variety of different kinds of sources. I don't have guidelines for English 102 that says you should have one newspaper, one this, one that. By now, you should know what is an appropriate source. If you're finishing English 102, that for many of you, this is your last English class, that means you should now have the ability to understand what is appropriate in terms of sources. And that's part of this project in the final presentation, is me being able to see that, yes, John knows the sources, he's awesome, and he knows what's appropriate sources, and he has those in his presentation. So if you need a little help with that, make sure you email me or check in the Bedford, check in the little DK handbook for more details on those types of sources. So final thoughts. Really, for my final thoughts, I just want to tell you guys, don't overthink the presentation. You've learned all these skills this semester. I know it's been a short summer, but you've learned these skills of how to take a piece and examine the audience, examine the purpose, examine the context, look at how and why something was created. And now you're just wrapping it all up in a bow, and this is your chance to just brag on yourself and say, hey, Professor Buzzard, look at all the things I learned, and they're here in this one delicious project, and I'm so excited for you to see it. And you might be nervous about it, but don't be nervous about it. I'm sure whatever you do is going to be wonderful, and I'm so excited to see what you guys come up with, because you've been, especially those of you who've stuck it through, you've been such a smart and thoughtful group. So I'm really excited to see what all you come up with. Just remember that we are posting these to the project board, and feel free to leave encouraging comments or way to go type comments underneath people's presentations. But it is public, and it's the last thing you post. And most people, when they post it, they're done, they're finished with the class. Please don't critique people's posts after they post their final project. That's for me to do in a private forum. You don't need to go through and tell them everything that's wrong with their project. That's just rude. So, of course, I have to say that because, you know, somebody's done that before. So just make sure that you're just keeping it positive on that final board. That's really all I have for final thoughts. You know, come to office hours if you have questions. Email me if you have questions, and of course use that discussion board and help each other. You know, we're a community here, and I hope that that you've really gotten a sense of community from this course. And I really hope that you have the best of luck and don't run into too many research roadblocks. They'll happen though. Don't get frustrated as you complete your final project.